Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
If you're interested in volcanoes, you need not go further than our national parks to get your fill. Did you know that 84 units of the national park system have volcanic resources? These parks run the gamut of having very active volcanic features to those where volcanoes form the landscape and contribute to the geodiversity of the park. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. The most active volcano in our park system is Kilauea in Hawai'i Volcanoes National Park on the Big Island of Hawaii. It's also one of the most monitored and researched volcanoes anywhere in the world. This week, the Traveler's Lynn Riddick talks to Professor Leif Karlstrom, whose recent research of Kilauea might be music to your ears. Lynn and Professor Karlstrom will be back in a minute.
The Everglades Foundation, the only organization whose sole mission is to restore and protect America's Everglades. Learn more at evergladesfoundation.org. Since 1986, national park visitors have turned to the best-selling guidebook Passport to Your National Parks to collect fun ink stamps from each of their explorations. Just take your passport book to any national park visitor center or park store and get your free ink stamp with the date and location of your visit. Personalize your passport even more by adding stickers, logging your favorite hiking trails, and mapping your next adventure. You can also show off your love for our national parks with passport-themed apparel and accessories. Best of all, 100% of proceeds from the Passport program support your national parks. Stamp your passport as you capture stories, preserve memories, and discover America's natural and historical treasures. We are park stewards to ensure our most wild and historic places remain for generations to come, to safeguard our preferred arena for adventure, reflection, and inspiration. We donate 4% of our proceeds, that's revenues not profits, to support America's most wild and historic places. We are Wild Tribute, apparel for the parks. Find out more at wildtribute.com. Whether it be strategy, business planning, change management, board development, executive search, or diversity planning, Potrero Group is here to help. They mix a depth of experience in the parks and land space with the breadth of best practices from other industries. For more information or to schedule a preliminary conversation, go to potrerogroup.com. Potrero group.com.
With me today is Leif Karlstrom, who is Associate Professor of Earth Sciences at the University of Oregon in Eugene. And we're going to talk about some recent research he's been doing regarding a different kind of technique, musical dynamics, if you will, to understand what's happening below the surface of the Kilauea volcano in Hawai'i Volcanoes National Park. Hi, Leif. Welcome to The Traveler.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, let's start with your position there at the University of Oregon and the type of work that is done by researchers there.
Yeah. So I work in an earth sciences department. So we study all sorts of things having to do with our Earth and other planets in the solar system. But I mostly focus on volcanoes. I maintain a research group consisting of graduate students and undergraduate students, and sometimes postdocs, about 6 or 7 people. Broadly speaking, in our department, we have actually quite a strong volcanology program. We actually have a dedicated cluster associated with volcano research, and all told, probably about 30 or 40 people here at the University of Oregon studying volcanoes.
And what kind of research do you personally focus on?
Yeah, so I work on all things related to how fluid moves around in Earth's crust. And so sometimes that actually extends beyond volcanology. I study landscape evolution and glaciology. But for the volcano part of my research, it's everything from active eruptions, like we'll probably talk about today, to ancient exhumed systems that are now exposed at the surface, and we can sort of look at the rocks and examine the plumbing system that way. So more geological, I guess. So everything from what people call geophysics, so looking at active signals that we record at volcanoes, to going out in the field and looking at rocks.
Now, you and your colleague, Josh Crozier, published some research last month on a new generation of volcano monitoring with the Kilauea volcano. And I want to have you share some details about your research, but first, tell us a little bit about Kilauea and why it's such a worthy volcano for studying.
Yeah, so Kilauea is quite special, and it's not just because it's a national park. It's actually the most active volcano on Earth and has been for quite some time, as far as we can tell. For that reason, it's also sort of one of the most widely studied globally. Many people have looked at this volcano, have monitored it in different ways, and so we know quite a lot about it. It's sort of a template, if you like, for volcanology generally. So if you're gonna study volcanoes, you have to study Kilauea in some sense. And there's a wonderful volcano observatory operated by the U.S. Geological Survey, situated right there, and they maintain a network of sensors that's also one of the best of any volcano globally. So for the type of work that we were doing in this study, it was an obvious choice.
Have you been out there many times?
I wouldn't say many. I can count them on one hand, but yeah, I've been there.
So tell us about this specific research you did with listening to the seismic data from Kilauea.
Sure. So we really relied on the fact that there is this wonderful existing network of instruments operated by the U.S. Geological Survey, and they make their data openly accessible to anyone. You could download their seismic data if you like from the internet. And so really, what we did here is mostly leverage existing data, but then sort of try to interpret that data in a new way. So we developed mathematical and computational models for the physical processes that we think are going on underneath of the volcano. And the particular sort of period that we were interested in studying was actually a quite long, effusive eruption that probably many people who have visited Kilauea in the last, I guess, 14 years now will know something about. In 2008, there was a opening at the summit of a small crater, the Halemaumau crater, and as soon as it opened, there was a lava lake that was
Molten
visible.
lava lake?
Yeah, molten lava lake. Yeah, that's right. So a pretty spectacular thing, couple 100 meters, so several football fields wide, and filled with hot liquid magma, not actively erupting. So it was actually, as long as you didn't get too close, fairly safe to observe. And many people did. You could go to the Hawai'i Volcanoes National Park and go check out the lava lake. It was quite popular at night, very spectacular glow and so forth. But it gave us sort of an opportunity to observe a volcano in sort of I don't know, I'm not going to say a sleeping state because it was actively erupting, but sort of a quiescent state for a very long period of time. So we actually studied the time period from 2008 when the crater opened all the way to 2018, which of course was the last major eruptive episode at Kilauea in which the summit crater collapsed and that lava lake drained away. So a 10-year period of time, which is actually quite long in studies of volcanoes. We don't have many other examples of long-lived eruptions that were quite as well monitored as this one. So because of the long time series, 10 years, we have the opportunity to sort of learn about the physical processes responsible for the signals that we see at Kilauea.
So where did you get this idea for this specific research, and how did you go about getting all the data?
Yeah, so this has been a project that's been in development for quite some time. In fact, it was a project that I started during my postdoctoral work. I was working with Eric Dunham at Stanford University. And at that point, we were not so much interested in Kilauea, but more interested in much more sort of basic physics of how magma moved around in conduits on very short timescales. And specifically, we were looking at sort of waves, sound waves, actually, and other types of waves that might be excited by sort of impulsive processes within the volcano. And so we developed a sort of a mathematical computational model of this process, and then went looking for a place to test it, essentially. And Kilauea came up as sort of the most obvious candidate. And so it was sort of at that point, which would have been, I don't know, 6 years ago or something, that we started looking at Kilauea specifically. And then Josh Crozier, who you mentioned, who's the lead author on the paper that recently come out, he was actually a PhD student in my group. No longer, he now works at the U.S. Geological Survey, actually. But at the time that was his PhD project, actually, is to sort of apply this model that we had developed to the Kilauea data. And so that took several years. He assimilated seismic data, he assimilated ground deformation data. And specifically what we were interested in, and the thing that sort of caught our attention from the perspective of the model, were these seismic events. They're called very long period seismic events, not a very exciting name, but it refers to the frequency content, the dominant frequency content of the signal. Happens to be sort of a dominant period of oscillation in the sort of 5 to 40 second range, which is fairly long compared to many signals that we see at active volcanoes. And so these very long period, or people often abbreviate it as VLP events, happened intermittently throughout the 2008 to 2018 time period. And we actually know how they were generated because chunks of the crater wall would episodically fall off into the lava lake. A fairly spectacular event, actually, that oftentimes generated small explosions that actually would be quite dangerous if you had been there. But what you see on the seismic network after one of these rockfall events is this beautiful oscillation, this very long period event. So we know it was triggered by the rockfall hitting the lake. And then our guess was that sort of forcing of the lake caused waves to bounce around within the plumbing system of the volcano, the conduit, and then the reservoir, some 2 kilometers below the surface. And that oscillation in the fluid coupled to the surrounding rocks, which then was picked up by the seismometers. So it's sort of a bit of a train of events to the event that we see, but that's a relatively simple type of signal and actually was something that we could model. So we call it a resonance event. And we hit the surface, much like hitting a drum. And so this is where the connection to music comes in, I suppose, is that the rock hits the lake. That's sort of like a mallet hitting a drum. And then the subsequent oscillation is the ringing of the bell, if you like, or the drum.
So technically these resonant events, did they manifest as sound waves?
No, they did not. Yeah. So these will be much too low frequency to hear. The human audible band is between 20 hertz roughly and 20 kilohertz. And so a hertz is 1 per second, right? So 20 hertz would be 20 cycles per second. And these are more like 40-second period, right? So much, much, much lower frequency. You would not be able to hear these. And furthermore, they're not actually sound waves. They're displacements of the ground surface. And so, you can see them in instrumental records, but you would not be able to hear them. We have to do some additional processing to hear them. And the hearing actually is, not so much connected to the actual modeling that we do. It's more like something that we did after the fact to try to understand and sort of listened in a different way, perhaps, to the data that we had analyzed.
So can we hear some of the samples?
Absolutely. We sort of have a couple of different ways in which we turn this data into sound. As I mentioned, it's not sound waves, right? It's just displacements of the ground. And so you can turn it into an audible signal by speeding it up. And so that's the simplest way. It's this procedure called sonification of data. That's I would say a underutilized technique broadly in science for representing and examining data. But for oscillatory data, like these seismic signals, you can simply just speed it up until it's in the auditory band. So that's what we did first. So I'll play you an example. This is 3 years worth of these VLP signals, sped up about 8,000 times, and then placed at the relative event occurrence. So you're going to hear many impulsive sounds. And I think it sort of sounds like an old sort of field recording of a marimba or something. So it has a sort of natural musical quality because of the simple resonant nature of the events. But you'll hear them occurring sort of at the relative times that they actually did occur. It's just much, much faster. So here, let me play it. So you're hearing sequences of events. Each one of those individual sounds corresponds to a rockfall onto the lake surface. And then the tone that you're hearing comes from the fact that the very long period seismic events actually have a very dominant frequency. And so it sounds quite musical. It actually sounds like you're hitting a drum. And that's natural. I haven't done any sort of processing to the data. It's quite unusual, actually, in some sense, for seismic signals to sound quite so musical. Oftentimes they're broadband and very noisy.
So those sounds are rocks falling into the lava lake?
That's right. Yep. Each one of those little impulsive events is sort of a bus-sized rock falling onto a lava lake. So quite a spectacular event. So this happened thousands of times over the 2008 to 2018 period. And so they basically gave us a continuous record of the changing properties. You can think of, the sound that you hear as reflecting, again, the sort of analogy to music, right? If you hit a drum, what does it sound like? Well, the shape of the drum dictates the frequency, and then the fluid inside, usually that's air, is what's resonating in the drum. And that's more or less exactly analogous to what we're doing here. So the tone that you perceive when you listen to this is reflecting both the shape of the plumbing system, the conduit and the magma reservoir beneath it, as well as the properties of the magma. And it turns out magma is quite a complicated fluid at volcanoes. It's a sort of a multi-phase suspension of bubbles and crystals in a silicate polymer melt, which is the molten rock. And its acoustic properties, if you like, are quite complex. And so that's one of the main things that we were interested in, is trying to see whether we could look for differences, like the differences in tone that you're hearing. The geometry of the plumbing system stays relatively constant on these timescales. And so any change in tone that you hear comes from changing fluid properties. And that's primarily temperature and bubble content.
Can you play us another clip?
I can. So another thing that we can do with this is sort of take one step back from the very direct sonification, where we're just speeding up the sound. And I'm going to use a technique that we're calling additive resynthesis, where we're taking the waveform and mapping it onto frequency while preserving the shape of the waveform, so the envelope of the waveform. And so this is a technique that's sort of useful for looking at signals that do not have very many cycles in them. So you could sort of hear each one of those drum beats in the sound that I played previously. It went by really fast, right? There's so for each individual event, you're not hearing very much detail, and sometimes that detail is of interest. Actually, it's telling you about the type of oscillation that is set up by the rockfall event. And so this additive resynthesis technique is sort of a way to get around the fact that you don't have very many oscillation cycles, and so speeding it up sort of compresses things. I will share my sound again. Here now we're listening to a much more tonal, much less drum-like sound. But again, all the impulsive sounds that you're listening to are sequences of these VLP events. This now sounds quite more musical in some sense. It's much more tonal. The tones are changing, and those changing tones are actually telling us something quite important about how the system is evolving. This now is actually a much longer time period. This is the entire 2008 to 2018 period.
So this clip that you're playing, and we probably won't hear the whole clip, but it takes place over the 10-year period using the seismic data compressed. Is that correct?
Yeah. So this has a couple more layers of I guess processing on it. So we're not actually using directly the seismic data. We're using the envelope of the seismic data and then the periods, and generating new sounds that have the correct envelope, but are at frequencies that we can hear. And we can control the duration of the event, and we can control the frequencies that you hear. And so you're listening, accurately to the relative frequencies now, as well as the relative time of all those events, but sort of mapped to a somewhat one step farther removed from the actual data itself.
Interesting. So how will this sort of new approach, with seismic resonance signals kind of fit into the overall understanding of what's happening beneath the surface and the likelihood of future eruptions?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of the $1 million question in some sense, right? We would like to be able to forecast volcanic eruptions. They tend to be quite hazardous if you're nearby, as we saw in 2018, right? Certainly lots of property damage and sometimes loss of life as well, right? There are examples in the historical record of really quite catastrophic eruptions, and so this is one of the background goals of my research, is to learn about how volcanoes work in the hopes that we can forecast. And so what we're doing here, I wouldn't say is going to lead directly to a new set of forecasts that will predict the next eruption of Kilauea. I don't think that's quite we're quite there, but I think what we're doing is we're establishing a new set of tools that allow us to peek into the subsurface of the volcano in more or less real time and sort of discern what's going on. And in combination with other types of data, I do think that there's probably enhanced predictability from this technique, because we're directly inferring the changing properties of the magmatic system that in some cases can lead to eruptions. So for example, bubbles are one of the primary drivers of volcanic eruptions and the explosivity of volcanic eruptions. And that's one of the things that we're backing out from these signals is changing bubble contents in the subsurface. So, combined with other types of data and probably with several more steps of validation, right, where we sort of check to make sure that our models are correct and we believe the output. I believe that there's sort of new tools on the horizon for forecasting eruptions.
Yeah, because, like you said, the Kilauea volcano in 2018 was major. Something like 700 homes were destroyed and roads were torn apart, and some roads even fell into the crater, and the lava covered like 13 square miles of land. Does anybody have any clue, any of the research that's happening now, have any idea of when something major like this might happen again?
I wouldn't go so far as to say we know when it will happen next, but we know that it will happen, again, because Kilauea has a long history of activity. And in fact, there is active lava at the summit now. So it has not gone to sleep. It's just sort of taken a breath, if you like.
This is Lynn Riddick with Leif Karlstrom. What would an active volcano sound like if each separate lava slosh, fountain of fire, and burst of steam were put to music? Well, Leif and his colleagues have done just that through their Volcano Listening Project, and we'll tell you about that after this short break.
Interior Federal Credit Union's rates have jumped again. Check out their new certificate rates at interiorfcu.org. Maximize your money for the future with terms from 6 to 60 months and a minimum opening deposit of just $500. Bump up certificates are also available to increase your rate one time during the certificate's term. Ready to start saving? Apply at interiorfcu.org. The Yosemite Conservancy helps visitors connect with Yosemite through adventures, volunteering, and the arts. It's the only nonprofit dedicated to supporting Yosemite National Park and funds grants to improve trails, restore habitat, protect wildlife, and inspire the next generation of nature lovers. Learn more at yosemite.org. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smoky's Life is a biannual magazine produced by Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokiesinformation.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It is also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That is why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people, inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org.
I'm Lynn Riddick, and I'm back with Leif Karlstrom from the Oregon Center for Volcanology. Now, in your spare time, you've got a separate project going on, one that puts volcanic eruptions to music and visual images. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So the Volcano Listening Project is sort of a collaborative effort, actually, between myself and a few other scientists. Ben Holtzman, Columbia University, I think is my primary collaborator. Anna Barth, who's at UC Berkeley now, Josh Crozier, who we talked about, and a few others, as well as some musicians. And I have a background in music. I was sort of, I guess, fortunate enough to grow up in a family for which science and music were both pretty important, I guess, influences on my life. And so I've played violin for most of my life and have had a professional music career myself. And so somewhat recently had the, I guess, inspiration to try and bridge the science and music parts of my life, and found a way to do so in this Volcano Listening Project. So it's both sort of an outreach effort. In some sense, we're trying to make the scientific stories, I suppose, and the data involved in those stories accessible in different ways to non-scientists through sound and through animations. And it's also a means of developing these sonification algorithms. So the things that we listened to in the previous discussion, those are sort of new methods that we're developing, and it's actual real research. So it's a bit of a blurry line, actually. It becomes part of my research agenda, and then also becomes, something that's a musical outlet. And we take the data, we take the sonified data from different volcanic events, and we interpret it, aesthetically. And that's now sort of quite far removed from the science itself, right? We're not literally interpreting all the ones and zeros, if you like, of the data, but it's more like an impression or subjective interpretation of that data.
Well, let's hear a sample of how you put music to Kilauea activity, and then I want you to describe what we're hearing too.
Sure, happy to do that. So I'll play a bit of a clip. Maybe I'll hop right in the middle or something like that, because it's a bit long. But we took a number of data streams. So in the previous discussion, we were just talking about seismic data, but of course, there's lots of other data collected at Kilauea. And so we took ground deformation, two different types of ground deformation, and actually SO2, sulfur dioxide gas emissions over a previous period of activity. Actually, I think it's 2000 to 2010. So actually the period leading up to what we talked about previously. Sonified that data. You can think about it as different voices, and you'll hear those different voices in the data. And then a group of musicians, I guess myself included, but also another violin player, a guitar player, and a bass player, got into a recording studio, put on headphones, piped the sonified volcano data into the headphones, and then improvised. So. So it's a bit mixed together, and that's actually the intent here, is that the sonified data becomes just another voice in the composition. So if you listen carefully, you'll hear some sounds that are not organic, generated by a computer. Then you'll hear the acoustic instruments.
You mentioned that you played the violin, and you play the violin on this clip. So did you try to be consistent when you saw a digital representation of, say, a lava fountain? Did you try to be consistent with how you played the violin at that particular point?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess, for those who know, say, classical music, right? Like there's a famous piece called The Four Seasons by Vivaldi, right? And I believe he was probably inspired by the fact that it was spring or summer or fall, right? But there's not a whole lot of data in that. And so I think you could sort of view this similarly, right? We react to the data, but we're not really trying to mimic it. We're trying to create a piece of music around it, if you like. And so, yeah, you might, if you sort of listen for those features, if you know what to listen for, maybe you'll hear something, but that's not really the point of this. It's much more, I would say, the aesthetics of the volcanic activity as a whole, rather than the specifics. You know?
So on your website, you share this music along with 3D animation of the Kilauea volcano. So where did the animation come from?
Yeah, so animation was made by a computer graphics colleague, Zach Marlowe McCarthy, and he actually did a wonderful job with that. He took real data, so a digital elevation model of Kilauea volcano, and then represented it in a creative way, first of all, sort of a pointillistic representation, but then also created an animation that was driven by the variations in the data itself. Right? And so you'll see it sort of shaking in a way that, of course, is not physical, but is reflecting some of the data and the sounds that are coming out of this. And we had different sort of animation elements associated with each of the different data streams. So we had very impulsive ground deformations, and those are splashes of color right at the summit. The SO2 gas emissions come in as sort of a distribution of red vertical lines. And, you know, it feels somewhat volcanic, but it's also quite abstracted. And, you know, this is one spectrum of the volcanic, one part of the spectrum of the volcanic listening project, where we're mostly focused on the sort of artistic side of this, the abstractions. But that animation actually has quite a bit of utility in the more directly scientific applications, because, of course, this is how we visualize the actual physical processes underlying the data. And so we use those same techniques, essentially mapping different parts of the data onto visual elements when we're making outreach products as well.
How about a sample of the Mount Redoubt volcano in Lake Clark National Park and Preserve in Alaska?
So Mount Redoubt is a different type of volcano than Kilauea. It's a stratovolcano in an arc, so different tectonic setting. Had a sort of rather famous sequence of eruptions in 2009 that involved explosions at the summit, and they were quite well recorded and exhibited some sort of odd things, I guess, including seismic signals that had a strongly gliding frequency content. And so that caught my attention as a neat sort of thing to sonify. Here we're going to go back to the direct sonification technique, where I'm just literally taking the trace of the seismometer, the ground shaking, and then speeding it up. And so what the sound that you'll hear is basically the lead up to an explosion, one of these eruptions. And it's quite remarkable, actually, because the lead up involves this sweep of frequencies. And so these things were called screams. And I think the sonification, I think, does that justice. So I'll just play it. And this is, you'll hear the sort of frequency sweep and then a big broadband noise event. And that's the eruption itself. Okay.
Wow, that's very interesting.
Yeah. So that one sounds almost I don't know. Clearly, you know when the eruption happened. In that case, it's not always the case, but.
Did you add musical instruments to that?
Nope, did not. So that one is just purely the data sonification. And so the Volcano Listening Project, I think, has a artistic, interpretive side, and then it has a very sort of scientific side where we're interested in representing accurately the types of variations that occurred in the data through sound. So this is an example of that.
How about the sonification of the Lone Star geyser eruptions at Yellowstone National Park? Let's hear those.
Sure. So this would be a case where we're taking different data streams of here, I guess maybe you could think of it as an analog volcanic system, right? Geysers erupt water, not magma. But in some cases, like these famous geysers in Yellowstone, do so very regularly. And Lone Star Geyser erupts more or less on the clock every 3 hours, and has so since the start of the instrumental record there, which is, I believe, around 1920. So a very, very consistent eruptive pattern. And so it's a nice template actually for studying active volcanoes, because of course it's not quite as dangerous and you know when it's going to erupt. And so there's been quite a lot of effort, and I've been involved in some of that, of instrumenting these geysers so that we can learn about real volcanoes. And so here's, I guess I'll play an example of a tilt meter data that we sonified. And here's a different type of sonification where we take the tilt, so it's just the angular displacement of the ground as the geyser swells up the reservoir inside through some eruption cycles, and we map it onto frequencies. So this is going to sound maybe more musical. It's just going to sound like a sweeping pitch, but you can view it as the motion of the ground. So when the pitch goes up, that's the ground swelling up. When the pitch goes down, and oftentimes it does so quite rapidly, that'll be an eruption. So it goes in cycles. You can hear the pitch going up and down and up and down. Okay. So those are the cycles of the geyser.
So those rises in pitch are what's recorded every 3 hours with the geyser?
Yeah, so it's the main eruptive event is like clockwork every 3 hours, but there's quite a lot of variation around it. There's a lead up period where water is sort of starting to come out of the cone, and that's quite much more complicated actually. And so you're hearing some of that as well.
Very good. Well, what's next on your plate, either through the university or your music project?
Yeah, so I think we're just getting started with this volcano listening project. We just are developing kind of the toolbox, and we'd love to see people start using it. We were starting to run workshops actually on data sonification, sort of teaching interested students the tools, I guess, the Python programming tools to create sounds from data. And so we hope a lot of people pick this up as an either, both from the aesthetic side, making music from volcanoes or whatever signals you like, as well as including this in scientific papers and discussions. So I'm quite excited about that. Of course, my project at Kilauea continues. There's more we can learn. So science is a long running endeavor. The timescale is years, if not decades, for results. So stay tuned, I guess.
Well, we will. I want to thank you for sharing your work with us today, Leif, and we'll be eager to learn more about the research you're doing and to listen to your volcano soundtracks.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me. It was nice.
That's our show for this week. We hope you enjoyed it. You can check out the complete Kilauea track and more musical volcanic sounds from Leif's band Small Town Therapy at volcanolisteningproject.org. Next week, we'll be sitting down with Yellowstone National Park Superintendent Cam Shawley to discuss how the park is recovering from devastating flooding that struck in June. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
Washington State is graced with 3 spectacular national parks, each different and special in their own unique ways. As the official nonprofit partner and the only philanthropic organization dedicated exclusively to supporting these parks through charitable contributions, Washington's National Park Fund has a mission to raise private support to deepen everyone's love for, understanding of, and experiences in Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. Share your passion for these parks at WNPF.org. The Grand Teton National Park Foundation is a private, nonprofit organization that supports projects that protect and enhance Grand Teton National Park's cultural, historic, and natural resources. By funding initiatives that go beyond what the National Park Service could accomplish on its own, Foundation donors improve the visitor experience and provide benefits to the national park system for decades to come. See their successes at gtnpf.org. The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling national park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit nationalparkstraveler.org.